session of the virtual seminars in economic theory. Today, we're very happy to have Niko Matouschek from Northwestern, who's going to talk to us about paying with purpose, a joint work with Luis Rayo. And we're also happy to have our panelist, Luis Garicano. The format of this seminar is as follows. We're going to have a 60-minute presentation with time for interim questions. And also we have, so Luis is got, the co-author Luis is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you want to ask a question, you can also ask it in the chat. And at the end of the talk, we're going to have around 15 minutes for Q&A, so Q&A session. Just to tell you that the talk is recorded, and that's all for me. So the floor is yours, Niko.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Spiros, for inviting me for an introduction. Thank you, Luis Garicano, for serving as the panelist. And thank you all for logging on and giving me an opportunity to tell you about this paper, which, as Spiros said, is called Paying with Purpose. It's joint work with Luis Rayo, and it's very new work. We are actively working on it. It's only the second time we're presenting the paper. And so comments are not just welcome, they're strongly encouraged. If you have any thoughts, any ideas, any concerns, please put them in the chat, and Luis Rayo is going to keep track of them. Now, the motivation of the paper is an MBA class that Luis and I are teaching here at Kellogg on organizational economics. And so over the last few years, we've been getting more and more questions from students about the role of purpose and meaning in attracting, retaining, and motivating employees. And frankly, we didn't have good answers to those questions. And so this is us trying to get better answers to understand the role of purpose and how it relates to, and it is different from, the more traditional incentive schemes like money that the course mostly focuses on. Good. So the starting point, is the observation that many firms, and many of the firms that recruit our students here at Kellogg, are pursuing purposes beyond profit maximization. Now, what those purposes are differs widely across firms, but one thing they have in common, which is that many, maybe most of them, are pro-social. That is, they're about creating value for third parties. They're about things like helping the local community, supporting suppliers in less developed economies, investing in the environment, and so on. And firms pursue these pro-social purposes largely through donations, both cash and in-kind donations, but also when they can by biasing business decisions in a way that favors their cause. And so a Dutch coffee company, for instance, may be paying above market prices for coffee beans because their purpose is to support their suppliers in those countries. And so the goal of our paper is to explore the role of purpose as an incentive instrument, right? The role of purpose and specifically of those kind of donations. And so what we're going to ask is why and how a profit maximizing firm should combine pay with purpose, with making those donations to motivate employees. The key feature that distinguishes purpose from both pay and other non-monetary benefits is that it's a public good. It's both non-rival and non-excludable. Now, the fact that it's a public good is both an advantage and a disadvantage for a firm that's trying to use purpose to motivate employees. It's an advantage because non-rivalry creates scale. When a firm rewards a deserving agent by donating to a cause that that agent cares about, they also reward any other deserving agent who cares about the same cause. At the same time, non-excludability creates what we call leakage, which is that if the firm rewards a deserving agent by donating to a cause they care about, inadvertently, they also reward all the undeserving, low-performing agents who happen to care about the same cause. And so what that implies immediately is that donations are going to be especially effective when success is broad, when the same dollar donation can be leveraged across many deserving agents and leaks only to a few undeserving ones. Now, In contrast to donations, pay, of course, is a private good that can be targeted at individual agents and neither benefits from scale nor suffers from leakage. That distinction between the private pay and public purpose is what's going to make sure that purpose is not just a substitute for pay, like many non-monetary benefits are, but a complement. And so what we're going to see is that in the optimal contract, the principal is going to use both instruments, purpose and pay, for different reasons. It's going to use purpose to reward team performance. It's going to use pay to reward individual performance. And it's going to use them in conjunction. They're going to complement each other. The principal is going to be better off using both than she would be using one but not the other. Good. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the related literature and how.
Niko, do you allow me to, I don't see what the hand is. Do you allow me to make an early question, like Chicago style, or is it too early?
Of course, no, never too early.
Okay, so I was asked to entertain people. So Niko, I think this is absolutely beautiful, and it makes a huge amount of sense, this idea of public goods. I was thinking about the labeling, the purpose. So David Kershaw, who's a professor at the LSE, kind of presented a paper in one of my classes where he talks about purpose and corporate law, and the way he thinks about purpose is as an animated mission purpose articulation of the reason for a corporation's existence. So the aspirational idea of what the corporation is for. And he gives examples like Google, organize the world's information, Tesla, accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy, Merck, we try to remember medicines for the patient. So you're trying to convey to people that we're not just here earning money, but we have a higher, quote, purpose. Do you want us to think of this broader class of purpose as mappable into your class, or do you want us to think of that as a separate issue that you don't want to talk about?
I think if I understand you right, I think your notion of purpose is closely related to our notion of purpose. I think we think of purpose as the firm's objective, where the traditional purpose of a firm is to make profits, right? And so now firms are saying, well, our purpose is not to make profits per se, but to help the environment, to help local communities, and so on. So I think it's very closely related. Now, where it's a little bit of a departure, perhaps, is that we're still assuming the firm to be profit maximizing. And so the firm itself doesn't care about the purpose. It's just a means to an end, where the end is ultimately, again, more profit. So the employees care about the purpose. The firm does not care about purpose per se. I think that's true. I imagine it's true for many firms, especially for publicly traded firms. At the same time, I'm sure it's also true that many startups, many smaller companies, pursue purposes other than profit maximization because the founder intrinsically cares about that purpose. So that we don't have in mind. We have in mind not a situation where the founder or the owner cares about the purpose per se. It's more a situation where they use the commitment to that purpose to more effectively motivate employees who do care. All right, good. With that, let me tell you about the related literature and how we contribute, how we see our contribution to those different literatures. And so again, the goal is to explore how donations can be used to motivate employees. And as such, we directly connect to two classic literatures, the literature on moral hazard in teams and the literature on public goods. Right? Our contribution to the first literature, to the literature on moral hazard in teams, is simply to introduce the second instrument, donations, the second incentive instrument, and explore its interplay with pay. Our contribution to the literature on public goods is specifically to the branch of that literature that looks at public good provision not by governments, but by firms. And so that literature, as far as we know, started with Kotchen's JP paper in 2006. Now, two contributions here. One is that the literature so far is looking at donations as a means to attract consumers, where again, we are looking at donations as a means to motivate employees. The second difference is that an important result in that literature is that unless firms have a technological advantage in making donations, the donation that the firm ends up making is no bigger or smaller than the donation that the consumers themselves would make. All right, so The firm could solve the free rider problem, but does not. We're going to have a different result in our setting because our setting is different and because we can use more general contracts. The firm is going to solve the free rider problem, but only if the team performs well. If the team does not perform well, not only does the firm not solve the free rider problem, but it may actually exacerbate it in the sense that it's going to give less than the employees would on their own. So those are classic literatures. More recent literatures that we relate to is, number one, the literature on corporate social responsibility. That literature distinguishes between three different reasons for why firms may engage in pro-social activities. One of them is what they call delegated philanthropy, where the firm engages in those activities on behalf of altruistic stakeholders. And so that's exactly what we have, where our stakeholders specifically are the employees. Another related literature is the literature on purpose and meaning at work, which explores the general notion that employees care about whom they work for, what they work on, who benefits from the value that they create, and so on. Our contribution here is, number one, we're going to focus very narrowly on the public good aspect of purpose. Purpose is, as Luis already suggesting, is a broad scheme and there are many different aspects to it. We are going to very much focus on that public good aspect, which we A, think is important, and B, has not been explored in that literature in the way that we will. Number two, our focus is going to be on the intensive margin of donations rather than the extensive one. So we are not interested in what cause are we going to support and whether we support a cause. Instead, our focus is on how much do I support that cause and why is it that firms make more donations one year than they do in other years. Now, that literature on purpose at work has an enormous and very rich and super interesting empirical branch that broadly shows that perhaps, at least to people at this school, not surprisingly, employees do care about more than pay and benefits. So there's a large literature. The part of the literature that's most relevant to us are a number of papers that directly look empirically at the effectiveness of donations on work choices and in particular effort. Right? So it might well be that employees care about donations, but the question is, do they care enough to impact their work choices, to impact how hard they work? And in a nutshell, these papers suggest that yes, they do, where these papers are using both lab experiments and to some degree field experiments. Good. So these are the different literatures that we relate to. One basic question that the literature, as far as we know, does not speak to is whether firms in practice are in fact using those donations to motivate employees rather than to attract consumers, for instance, and how they do so. And so the last thing I want to do before I jump into the model is go through a small number of examples and patterns that both motivate what we do and directly relate to some of the implications of the model. So number one, there are many examples of firms in which the firm does make these donations, not to attract consumers, but to engage the employees. And so one example, for instance, would be corporate law firms, which routinely allow their lawyers to engage in pro bono work. Right? They don't do that, presumably, to attract more clients who themselves are for-profit companies. Right? Instead, they do that because their lawyers value that kind of work. And so it's a perk of sort, it's a benefit of sort that the law firm uses to attract and maybe motivate those lawyers. Right? And so any firm that makes these kind of donations, whose clients are for-profit company and a B2B company, chances are that we're not making those donations to attract consumers, and perhaps we're doing it to motivate employees. Number two, when firms pursue these pro-social purposes, they typically commit to a single, well-defined purpose rather than multiple shifting ones. Right? And so Patagonia for many years, for instance, has been associated with supporting the environment. Tom's, which is a famous shoe company, has long been associated with poverty alleviation and helping the local community. So it's a narrow defined purpose that doesn't change over time. What we're excluding here, what you might think about, are donations that firms also make to match donations that the employees choose to make, right? Those donations are different from what we have in mind. Here, the purpose is chosen by employees who may very well not know what purposes other employees support. Right? So to us, these matching programs are more like standard private good non-monetary benefits. They're different from what we have in mind. What we have in mind are donations that the firm makes not to causes chosen by their employees, but to a cause that they themselves choose. And again, that cause is narrowly defined and typically doesn't change much over time. Now, when you look at what determines those donations, very often, typically, I would say, they're tied to team performance. So they're linked to things like overall profits, overall sales, overall number of units produced, shipped, or sold. Right? Moreover, the rules that map these performance measures into actual donations tend to be very simple. They're often just a constant fraction of profits, a constant fraction of sales that we're donating. And so in that, they're using much less information than firms use when they decide on the wages that they're paying, right? When they're using very granular information, scorecards, subjective performance evaluations, KPIs to decide how much each different employee gets paid. That information is much richer, much more granular than the information they appear to be using when they decide on their donation. Next, a lot of these donations follow threshold rules, where we stop donating when team performance falls below a threshold. All right, and so for instance, Tom's, which donates a share of profits every year, a fixed share of profits, while they don't donate anything in years in which they're making losses, in line with this notion of a threshold rule. And then lastly, there's this vague sense that companies that pursue pro-social purposes to motivate their employees are also companies that value teamwork and collaboration. There's one paper in particular by Andrea Pratt and co-authors who shows that correlation in a larger sample of US firms, but there are also many of these cases and case discussions that we use in our class, in which firms seem to be doing both. They emphasize the pro-social aspect of their work, and they emphasize collaboration between the employees. And I say this again, not only to motivate what we're doing, but as you'll see, it directly relates to some of the implications that immediately come out of the model. Good. And so this brings me to the end of the introduction. And so unless there are any further comments or questions, I'll just jump right into the model and tell you what that looks like. Good. So the model, we hope, is the simplest possible one, where we take a very standard Holmstrom-like team setting and make just one change. And that change is we allow the principal to make a donation to a cause that the agents care about. Good. So in the model, there's going to be one principal and n identical agents. Each agent chooses effort AI at some cost, which we also assume is linear, it's just equal to AI. Together, the efforts are going to generate both an output, a team output, which we denote by Y, and individual signals, one signal SI for each agent. And they're going to generate these signals through a density F. We're going to assume that the likelihood ratio satisfies MLRP. We're going to denote that likelihood ratio by Li, and we're going to refer it to the score of agent I. Now, the score, obviously, as you can imagine, is going to be important in the optimal contract. What is also going to be important in our contract is what we call the team score and each agent's peer score. The team score is simply the sum, the aggregate score of all of the agents. And so as such, it's a measure of the performance of the team overall. And agent I's peer score is the aggregate score of all of that agent's peers. So if it's agent I we're talking about, then it's the team score minus his own score. It's a measure of how well the colleagues, the peers of agent I have done in aggregate. The principal is going to be risk neutral, pays a positive wage, makes a positive donation. The outlay is sometimes going to play sometimes going to play a role. The outlay is simply the total amount of money that in a given state the principal pays either in terms of donation or in terms of wages. I'm going to note that by M. Agents, as I said, they're identical. They have the same utility function. They care both about wages and about the donation. They care about the public good. Where U is increasing, it's concave, positive, cross partial, and we're going to assume that inata conditions are satisfied on both ends.
Right. It's a good time to ask about the model, or do we wait until you present it fully? Maybe
let me give you one more bullet point and make one more comment, and then I'm done describing it, and then maybe a good time. So we're going to follow the standard approach where we take the effort profile as given. We're going to further assume that each one of these identical agents puts in the same amount of effort. And then we're going to look at the relaxed problem where we replace the IC constraint for each agent with their first order condition, which looks like this, where the left-hand side is the marginal benefit of working a little bit harder, and the right-hand side is the marginal cost. All right, so that's the whole model. Notice that what is not in the model is the participation constraint. That's because we want to focus on the role of donations in motivating employees rather than in attracting and retaining them. Having said that, the very last slide of the presentation is going to add a standard participation constraint to the model. I'm going to essentially argue that it doesn't really make a difference to the results as long as we redefine those scores in the right way. Good. And so that's the model. And so now maybe it's a good time for any questions about the setup.
So, Niko, a couple of comments or thoughts. One is I'm still thinking about the broader purpose corporation, the one that is mission driven. I'm working on SpaceX because I want to send a rocket to Mars. So if I look at your utility function, a couple of things. One clear thing is the mission driven is yes, mission driven or not, but the principal doesn't control how much mission driven. I mean, he cannot just say we get 30% mission driven. He's like, okay, there's a mission. It is public good. So your ideas are applying in many ways. There's a public good. If I don't work hard, I don't get the public good, which is the success that all of us feel the good news of the success. But it seems to me that there's not a G level that can I map the G in the Mars. Going to Mars is my mission type purpose. And my second, just to give you the two so that you can react, is
can I respond? I'm getting old enough that my memory gets bad. So let me respond to the first one and then give me the second one. So here's how I would think about that is the firm can make profit maximizing decisions or it can bias decisions to favor the purpose, right? And so SpaceX could profit maximize, or I could say, you know what, the people working for me, they really care about going to Mars. I'm going to overspend on that. Right? And so here the donation is not a cash donation, but it's essentially the same. It's because I'm distorting away from profit maximization to favor that cause. Right? Let me give you another example. Patek Philippe is one of the companies we talk about in the course. They make very fancy watches. They pay very low salaries, but they give these employees a chance to be the best watchmakers they can be. And so they overemphasize perfection. And do crazy stuff that arguably is not reflected in the prices they can get for their watches, but it helps the employees, it creates more purpose for the employees by allowing them to be, the best watchmaker they can possibly be, rather than the best watchmaker that the company needs. So we here in the paper, we think deliberately about just cash donations, which are very, very common, but we have a broader notion where I might donate by distorting this, just like the Dutch coffee company I mentioned. They pay above market prices for the suppliers, right? So I might donate indirectly by distorting business decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. So what about, Niko, the WG cross derivative? Why are these things complementary and not separable or something else? What is the rationale for that?
So they might very well be separable. In fact, the later results are going to assume separable utility, which is going to clean things up. We think it's more natural for them to reinforce each other rather than be substitutes, right? So it's saying if I get a higher wage, I get more utility from making a donation, which seems plausible to us. maybe more plausible than the notion that if I'm richer, I care less about the donation. But it's certainly not important that there is a strict complementarity that could just be independent. In fact, that's going to be cleaner. Very good. With that, let's derive the
Sorry,
optimal.
Niko, I have a question. What are we assuming about what the firm can observe about? So can they observe the total team score, the peer score?
Right.
Presumably, I mean, because you're going to talk about free riding, they can only observe and condition on team score. But
good. The principal can observe everything but the agent's effort choices. All right, so it observes the signals, it observes output, it observes the individual performance signals if you want SI, and from that it can work out the likelihood ratios. And obviously it knows the wage and the donations. So it knows everything. Everything is public, except for the privately chosen effort choices by the agent. All right, great, good. So let's derive the optimal contract. Starting point is the Lagrangian that the principal solves. Just 3 observations about the Lagrangian. Number 1, the multiplier on the incentive constraint is denoted by lambda. So you're going to see lambda a lot. Whenever you see lambda, remember that's the incentive multiplier. Number 2, because all the agents are identical, there's only one lambda and not n different ones. Right? So there's not a lambda I, there's only one lambda, again, because the agents are identical. And number 3, think about an increase in the wage of one agent I. If we increase WI, that affects only the incentive constraint of that agent. It does not affect the incentive constraints of the other agents, precisely because it is a private good. If instead we increase the donation G by $1, that affects the incentive constraints of all of the agents. And so that's reflecting this private good, public good difference between pay and purpose that motivates the paper. And that's going to shape the optimal contract in a way we'll get to in a couple of slides. Good. So that's a problem. We're going to solve the problem in 2 steps, where the first step fixes the total outlay of the principal and asks, well, given some amount of money that you have, some outlay, some budget, how do you optimally split it between the private wages and the public donation? Right? Now, if you look at the problem, for given outlay, the split only affects the principal's problem through the constraints. The objective itself does not depend on the split. It depends on the total outlay, but once we fix the total outlay, the principal doesn't care whether she spends the money on wages or on the donation, because the principal is not altruistic, the agents are altruistic towards the cause. Okay? And so what that's to say is that that split problem, what the principal is going to do is just maximize the aggregate incentive slack subject to feasibility. So given outlay, she's going to choose wages and donation to maximize the aggregate score-weighted utility of the agents, subject to total outlay being equal to the given M, and both of them being positive. The first proposition characterizes the solution to that problem and says that the allocation that the principal chooses is efficient, is Pareto efficient, if and only if each one of the scores is positive. Why is that? Well, if each one of the scores is positive, then the principal wants to reward all of the agents, and she does so efficiently by allocating the resources that she has, the outlays that she has, efficiently between wages and the donation. There's no reason, in fact, there's a cost to distorting the allocation from efficiency. Things are different if one or more agents have a negative score. In that case, the donation rewards those agents, which are agents that the principal would like to punish because they perform poorly. And so to limit this spillover, to limit this leakage, as I called it earlier, the principal is going to distort the allocation away from efficiency by underinvesting in the donation. Good. So that's the first proposition. To put it into context, it is helpful to compare this solution to the split problem to what would happen if the employees got to make the donations directly rather than the principal on their behalf. And that's what we call the decentralized donation benchmark. So in that benchmark, the principal doesn't implement W star G star. Instead, she pays the donation G star out to the agents by boosting their wages and then let them choose how much to donate. All right, so gross pay then is W star plus D, where the DIs have to add up to the donation. All of that is just saying we're taking the donation and now we're just splitting it one way or another by boosting the wages of the different agents. After that has happened, then the agents just independently choose how much to donate, right? Where each donation has to be positive and cannot exceed the wage of that agent. Now, let's call G double star the aggregate donation of all the agents in that decentralized giving game. And let's remember that when I say peer score of an agent, what I mean is the aggregate score of all the peers of that agent. Okay. With that, the next proposition says that if all the peer scores are positive, if every agent has successful peers in that sense, then the donation that the firm makes, G star, is always going to exceed the aggregate donation that the agents make on their own. But if that's not the case, if there's at least one agent with a negative peer score, then G star is going to fall short of G double star. So not only is the principal going to give less than the efficient level, it's actually going to fall short of what the agents give themselves. Right? And you have to be a little bit more precise. That's going to happen for some distributions. You can always find a distribution so that that's the case. So what's going on? Well, suppose we're in the decentralized giving game and agent I makes a donation. That's always going to benefit the other agents. But the question is whether that benefits the principal or hurts the principal. Right? Well, if that agent's peer score is positive, then him giving to the cause, him making a donation, imposes a positive externality on the principal, because inadvertently he's rewarding all those other agents who are agents that the principal doesn't want to have rewarded because in aggregate they performed well. If, however, the agent has a negative peer score, then by giving, again, it benefits the other agents, but now that's a negative externality it's imposing on the principal. Right? Because now the donation is rewarding agents that the principal would rather punish. So the principal, of course, internalizes these externalities, which is why it gives more than the agents do when they all have positive peer scores and the externality is positive, and she gives less than the agents do whenever they have a negative peer score and the externality is negative. Good. So maybe let me just wrap that up by saying that the firm can always solve the free rider problem. In fact, it does solve the free rider problem if the team performs well, in the sense that every agent has successful peers. But if that's not the case, not only is the firm not going to solve the free rider problem, it's going to exacerbate that problem, potentially at least by giving less than the agents would on their own. Good. So this is a digression. This was a small digression into an alternative setting just to interpret that first result. Now we're going back to the main model. Remember, we're solving the principal's problem. We've solved the split problem. Now we're going to solve the remaining problem, which is, well, what's the optimal outlay? And here you just differentiate the Lagrangian with respect to the outlay. Let's suppose that the donation is positive. Then the first order condition looks like this, where the left-hand side is the marginal benefit of an increase in outlay, and therefore in the public good, and the right-hand side is the marginal cost. That condition looks very familiar, I think, to public, to economists and to people familiar with public economics, right? It's just the Lindahl condition. At least it's a Lindahl condition when lambda and all the scores are equal to 1. Okay. Our condition differs from the Lindahl condition because our principal is not interested in efficiency per se. Instead, she's interested in motivating the employees, which is why when she decides how much to invest in the public good, she takes into account their performance as summarized by the scores, and she takes into account the incentive multiplier. Good. So those are the two separate problems. Now we can put them together and characterize the optimal contract. which is what the next proposition does. So what does that say? That says the principal is going to pay an agent I a strictly positive wage if and only if they have a strictly positive score. And she's going to make a strictly positive donation if and only if the team score is strictly positive. Moreover, if she does pay a strictly positive wage, then that level of the wage is determined by the first order condition on the left. And if she does make a strictly positive donation, the level of the donation is determined by the first order condition on the right. How are those two first order conditions different? Well, the one on the left says that for given G, for given donation, the wage of the agent only depends on his own score. Or another way to say this is an agent's wage depends on the scores of other agents only through the donation. In contrast, the condition on the right says that the donation always depends on all the scores. In particular, it depends on what we're going to call the weighted team score, the marginal utility weighted team score. Good. Let's look at the separable case that Luis alluded to. Then the solution looks extra clean, right? And so what separability does is fully decouple the two incentive instruments so that each wage depends only on that agent's own score and the donation depends only on the team score. Good.
So when you put, sorry, Niko, when you put strict inequalities, it's because this thing is in the denominator that's going to infinity. I mean, that's
right. So the Inada conditions play an important role here in getting that sign test to work. Exactly.
Otherwise, it would just be the same, but with an inequality, with a not strict.
Right.
I see.
That's right.
Okay, I see. Makes total sense.
Good. So what is the saying? The saying that wages reward individual performance and donations reward team performance, where the appropriate performance measure for team performance is the weighted team score, where the weight is just the marginal utility. A couple of things follow from that. First thing that follows is that the principal is going to use donations more sparingly than she uses wages. In the sense that there are going to be states in which we pay wages but make no donation, but not the reverse. Right? So when the team score is positive, then we make a donation. Right? In that case, at least one of the individual scores has to be positive, so we also pay wages. But the reverse is not the case. If the individual score is positive, I pay you a wage, but that doesn't mean that the team score is positive, and I therefore also make a donation. Right? So in that sense, we're going to use wages more often. We're going to use performance pay, if you want, more often than we use those donations. At the same time, the donations are not a rare exception, because remember, the scores on average are going to be 0, and the team score on average is going to be 0. And so if the score distribution is symmetric, for instance, then that means that we're going to make donations 50% of the time. Right? So donations don't happen as often as bonuses, if you want, but they happen regularly, I think is how we would interpret that result. Good. Another implication of the fact that wages reward individual performance and donations reward team performance is that donations require less information than wages do. That the principal needs less information to set the donation than she needs to set wages. All right, and so that's follows pretty directly as corollary 1, which just points out that the wage vector W star depends on the full vector of scores, while for given wages, the donation depends on all the scores only through a single scalar, which is that weighted team score. Good. Now, in some settings, this asymmetry in the informational requirement of wages and donation is especially stark. In those settings, wages depend on all the signals, but the donation depends only on team output Y and ignores the individual signals SI. And so that's what the next proposition is saying, which is given a condition on the distribution of signals, so that the statement I just made is true, so that the optimal donation G star depends on Y, but not on the individual signals. Right? And so what that condition says essentially is that conditional on output, the individual signals are informative about the distribution of effort, but not about aggregate effort. And because the donation depends on aggregate effort, the principal is going to ignore the individual signals and base the donation only on output. When is this condition satisfied? Well, it's satisfied, for instance, in a standard Gaussian example in which we have common and idiosyncratic shocks. So let's look at that example. Output there is just the sum of all of the agent's efforts and a common shock, epsilon 0. And the signal of agent ISI is just the sum of that agent's effort plus that common shock plus an individual shock where all the shocks are normally distributed. Right? Then we just crank out what the score looks like, right? And what that is saying is that, well, the individual score depends on the principal's estimates of all of the different shocks. Depends on what the principal thinks epsilon 0 is. It depends on what the principal thinks epsilon I is. And it depends on what the principal thinks the individual shocks of all the other agents were. Now, remember, wages depend on Li. And so what this is saying is that when the principal sets wages, she's going to engage in relative performance evaluation, just like Holmstrom pointed out in his 82 paper. Now, donations are different. Donations are going to depend on absolute performance. Why? Because that second term, if you add over all the agents, that second term has to add up to 0. Right? And so that the team score depends only on the firm's estimate of the common shock, which is just fully determined by the output Y. Right? And so here, just to illustrate that asymmetry, that stark asymmetry in informational requirements, donation depends on Y, pay depends on Y, and all of the individual signals. Good. How are we doing time-wise? Oh, I should maybe I'm good in time. And so the takeaway here is, again, wages depend on relative performance, donation depend on output. Next, so now we're moving away from information to the next issue. The next issue is how do changes in the production environment, like the need for collaboration between the workers or the size of the team, how do such changes affect the optimal contract? Now, such changes in the production environment are going to enter the problem by changing the score distribution, the distribution of the scores. And what the next proposition says is that under separable utility and an additional mild condition on the utility function, when the scores become more correlated, then that's going to relax the incentive constraint. It's going to lower the incentive multiplier, and therefore it's going to allow the firm to pay lower wages and make a lower donation, but still achieve the same effort level. Okay, so essentially, more correlated scores are good. They make it easier for the principal to motivate the agents. Now, why is that? That is because more correlated scores reduce that leakage problem that we talked about and allows the donation to work better. Right? If scores are very correlated, either all the agents have positive scores and I can reward them all, and I want to reward them all with a donation, or none of them have positive scores and I'm not going to make a donation because I don't want to reward any of them. Right? That's when donations work well. Donations work poorly when half the agents get a positive score and half the agents work a negative score, which is when that leakage problem is big and the scale effect is small. Right? And so quite naturally, when we're correlated, when we're positive correlated, that doesn't happen so much. And so intuitively, the donation works extra well, which makes it easier for the principal to solve the incentive problem. More formally, if we just look at the optimality conditions for the separable case, then on the right, we have the IC constraint, where the second expectation is the donation channel. So this is the marginal benefit of the agent from providing more effort that comes from higher scores leading to higher donations. Okay? That term depends on the team score both directly, as you can see, and also indirectly, because remember, the donation depends on that team score. What DARA, what decreasing absolute risk aversion does, which is that additional condition I alluded to, is it makes sure that that expression is convex. in the team score. And then that gives us the result that more dispersion and mean preserving spread of the team score is going to increase that term, that relaxes the IC, that lowers the lambda, that in turn lowers the wages and the donation. Good. So correlation makes the donation work better. We're going to lose less of both. One intuition that Luis and I have is that, yes, we can use less of both, but maybe we now, in relative terms, should be using the donation more. We should rely more on donation and less on money because, again, the donation is working better. Right? And so that's a statement about the expected donation, the average donation, and the average wage bill. Right? But this is something we're still working on. So far, we just have an example. Right? So assume normality, assume separable utility as we have, assume CRA utility functions with the same risk aversion for both wages and the donation. And let's rho denote the correlation parameter. Then we can just crank out what this expected donation to expected wage bill ratio looks like. And the key thing to notice that that expression is increasing in rho. So the bigger rho is, the more correlated the scores are, the more we're going to use the more we're going to use donations relative to wages on average. Good. So that's the impact of correlation on the use of the incentive instruments. The question is, why do we care about changes in correlation? What's causing those changes in correlation, right? And there are at least two changes in the environment that are going to make the scores more correlated. One is if it becomes more difficult to measure the individual contributions of the agents. If we move more towards a teamwork setting in that sense, that I can observe joint output but not individual output. And in that case, naturally, the scores are going to be more correlated, and the things I just talked about are going to follow. Another related reason for why the scores might be more correlated is that there's more scope for cooperation between the agents. Right? In particular, suppose that when I work harder, I don't only increase my own score, but I also increase the score of my peers. Right? And so there's spillover, if you want, in that sense. Well, then our scores are going to get more correlated. And again, the results I just talked about follow. And so just to make this more precise, what I'm trying to say, let's go back to the Gaussian example, but let's augment it by allow for collaboration. All right, so it's the same signal structure as before, but now there's this additional term which says that the signal for agent I, how well agent I performed, is also going to depend on the efforts of all the other agents. Where C now measures the size of that spillover, it measures the importance of collaboration in that sense. Right? Then we can work out rho, and what that's saying on the left as well, rho is going to be bigger, number one, if the sigma S to sigma 0 ratio is bigger. That's to say if the individual signals are more noisy than the common signal is, if it's harder to assess the performance of individual agents. And number two, rho is also going to be increasing in C. And so the more important collaboration is, the more correlated the scores, the better donations work, the less donation we need, the less wages we need, but maybe in relative terms, we're moving to using more donation relative to money. Finally, the last change in the production environment we look at is a change in team size, how many agents we have. Right? Here, our result is the following. So again, I'm not sure I'm going to call it a non-result, but it's a result about ambiguity of the effect. It's saying under the same conditions as the previous proposition, if I increase the team size, that's going to make the team score more dispersed, just like an increase in correlation does. But it's going to have an ambiguous effect on the incentive constraint. Why? Because while there's this dispersion effect that's going to make donations work better, there's also a dilution effect, which is that the bigger the team is, the less impact each agent has on that team score that determines how much of a donation we're giving, which is captured into the expression simply by the fact that the second term is multiplied by 1 over n. So the bigger n, the smaller 1 over n, the less of an impact I have on the team score, therefore the less of an impact I have on the donation. And therefore that works against making the donation work well. So in general, the effect of team size on the effectiveness of donation is going to be ambiguous because of these two opposing forces. If we go back one last time to the Gaussian example with a fixed coefficient, correlation coefficient, we have the same expression as before. And what it's showing is that these two forces, dilution and dispersion, cancel each other out exactly when rho is equal to 1, when we can only observe team performance, when our team is maybe a rowing boat, and the only thing we can see is the time the boat used, but not the contribution of each individual rower. Then those two things are canceling each other out. But apart from that case, dilution is always going to dominate dispersion, which is to say that donations work worse in larger teams than in smaller teams. So in larger teams, they see the incentive constraint is bigger, the incentive multiplier is bigger. We have to pay bigger wages and bigger donations to get the effort level that we desire. Good. Let me check time. I think I'm exactly on time. That's the main model. And if there are no questions from Luis or anybody else, I can just briefly tell you about the extension and then wrap up. Good. So let me tell you about extensions. One extension is to allow for employee donations. So a feature of the core model is that only the principal can make donations and the agents cannot. That's a convenient assumption. It might also be the right assumption in settings in which donations require firm resources, right? Which is very common. Now, what's also very common is that firms just make cash donations to charities that also accept money from the employees. And so the question is, in settings like that, in settings in which employees can top up the donation of the firm, what happens? Okay. So that's what we explore in this extension. It's the same model as before, except that after the principal pays wages and makes the donation, now each agent can top up. They can choose how much to add, how much of a donation to add, where the donation, again, has to be positive and cannot exceed their wages. Okay. The next lemma follows directly from prior work and says that in an equilibrium of this game, for given wages and given firm donation, there is a wage threshold, and each agent is going to donate any wages that exceed that threshold and is not going to donate if the wages fall below that threshold. Good. Now, the principal only cares about the final allocation. They only care about the net wages and the net donation that has happened, right? And she can implement any final allocation by satisfying a no topping up constraint that requires each agent's wage WI to fall below that threshold W bar, which itself depends on the donation G. Okay. So we just add that constraint for each agent to the problem. You solve the problem. You get exactly the same solution as before, except for the change that's highlighted very modestly here in purple, if you can see that difference. Right, what is that difference saying? The difference is saying, well, everything's the same as before, except for some agents whose wages we are going to cap at W bar. Who are those agents? These are agents with positive scores and negative peer scores. They are agents who themselves perform well, so we should reward them, but they have peers who perform poorly, so we don't want to reward those. The problem with those agents is because we're paying them a high wage, they will want to donate, and by donating, they're imposing a negative externality to the principal because they are rewarding inadvertently all those low-performing agents. Okay? So we're going to prevent them from doing that by capping wages.
So, Niko, can I make a comment? Have you finished explaining this?
Pretty much, yes.
So this is A, super cool, and B, a bit weird. So it is kind of interesting, and I see like, I mean, it's a mathematical and technically really cool, but I'm wondering, like, is it reasonable to think that the only way that I can donate is inside this G? I mean, can I not just donate outside, or is it reasonable that you're going to have me because my other guys are the other guys? I mean, it's kind of the good performers earn lower wages because the other guys are bad. I mean, those two things kind of surprise me a bit.
Yeah, I share. I think your feeling. I can convince myself that it's a real economic effect, right? If I'm a company that motivates people by donating to a certain cause and everybody does poorly, I don't want the few super performers to reward them by making big donations. So I can see the economic mechanism. The question, I think, is perhaps about its importance. And so here, Luis Rayo in particular, but I share that. We have this feeling that somehow the firm perhaps wouldn't lose much money if it ignored these top-up donations by the employees, because ultimately, especially in bigger groups, they're not going to increase that donation that the firm makes by very much. Right? So that's kind of, I think that's our feeling. I think that gets in the direction of what you're saying. So far, we haven't found a good way to formalize that notion that somehow ignoring that constraint is not going to hurt profits very much.
And these guys could quit, right? I mean, they're your good guys, and you're screwing them. They're going to be your pros.
Good. So that brings us to the next and final slide, which is the participation constraint. Before I go there, let me just wrap this up by saying that what this is suggesting is that donations go hand in hand with a more egalitarian wage structure. Or another connection maybe to make is to that famous New York Times article by Milton Friedman, in which he says, firms should step back from making donations and let employees make those donations themselves. Right? What this is saying is that the optimal response to employees being able to make donations is not to do that, is not to step back, but instead to keep making donations yourself and in fact discourage employees from adding to the donations that firms are making by compressing wages. Good, but all of that with a footnote, with a Luis Garicano footnote of, well, maybe sounds right in terms of economic forces, but we're not sure how important it is quantitatively. Good. Last extension is just to add that participation constraint that I mentioned before. That's actually a subtle issue because you have to decide what the outside option looks like. Right? So you could say, well, if it's a public good, you're going to benefit from that public good even if you don't work for that company. And so maybe your outside option should depend on G as well. Right? Then things get interesting, and maybe then there's a selection issue that you could focus on, that making a donation allows me to attract some types of workers but not others. Here we're going to switch that off. We're just going to follow the traditional approach of assuming that the agent's outside option is a constant. It's a constant U bar utility that can I get. And if that's the approach we're taking, then the optimal contract is as in the baseline, as long as we augment the scores appropriately. And so the new score is just the old score plus the ratio of the multipliers. And then the characterization goes through as before. Good. So with this, I think exactly on time. Let me conclude. What we look at in this paper is the joint use of public and private rewards. The advantage of private rewards is that I can target, it's a private good, I can target the reward in individual agents. The advantage of public rewards is the scale advantage, but there's also this leakage problem that we talked about. A bunch of things follow. Number one, donations are conditionally efficient. Sometimes the firm solves the free rider problem. Sometimes it doesn't. In fact, it might make it worse. It might exacerbate the free rider problem. Donations are based on team performance, and they complement wages, which are rewarding individual performance. They follow threshold rules. They're used more sparingly than wages, but they're not an exception. They're used regularly in some sense. They require less information than wages do, and are especially helpful in settings in which individual scores are highly correlated, for instance, because collaboration is important. Team size has an ambiguous effect on the effectiveness of donations. And finally, employee donations require wage caps that lead to more egalitarian wage structures. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niko, for this very interesting talk. So Luis, do you have any general comments about the paper?
I mean, my general comments is that it's just stunningly clean. It's a little jewel of a model in how well it's set up and how well it's developed, how well it goes to the end. My main comment is the first comment. So I kept thinking about this other purpose. And I wonder, like, they can do two things. They can do it the way you guys can do it the way you just said it, which I think is perfectly fine, and I feel comfortable. The other way is to say, well, We're going to explicitly extend the model to think a little bit harder about this purpose within the technology. We're going to think of a model where we're going to choose production technologies that make people feel purpose. And I think the public good aspect is still true. So people directly care about what the company is doing, as you very well said, Niko, beyond the money. And it's not the money, it's just what we are doing. And you, as the company, you're thinking, you know what, as you very well put it, we're going to go to Mars, even though it would make more sense to go to the moon, because Mars is really going to motivate people. And so the reward that you're choosing now is not just a donation or a G, but it's actually what you're producing in order to get this purpose. So it's very, very close. And I would imagine that a lot of what you're saying would go through, but I mean, it might be interesting or not. I mean, I love what you presented. I think it's super clean and super useful, and it works really like a charm. And I think the key insight of team incentives through purpose is fabulous. So that would be my main comment. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you, Luis. Let me give one more response to what you just said, which is I agree with you. I think this, as I said earlier, the notion of contributing to the cause not through cash donations, but by distorting decisions, I think is very similar to what we have in mind. The thing that you suggested, though, is a little different, right? Which is I'm making a discrete choice of what production technology to use. That's more about the extensive use of versus the intensive one, right? The key feature of our model that we cannot do without is that the firm can regulate how much it's contributing to that purpose. So how much do I spend extra on sending you to Mars, for instance, right? So that we can do. But if it's just like, oh, we're going to go in this direction now permanently just because you value it, then I think that has probably more to do with participation, with attracting workers who value that mission versus rewarding them. Because again, that I can then not change in response to your performance, right? Because I'm not going to switch production functions in a good year versus a bad year. Right? So I think it's very closely related, but if we think about the biasing business decisions, they have to be decisions that affect the intensive margin and not the extensive margin.
Okay, great. So any questions from anybody else?
I have a question, but I'm happy to defer to other participants.
Okay, I'm going, and then we'll see.
Okay, so so I know it's a little bit about the extensive margin again, but I'm now thinking of companies because some of your examples are companies where the charity money should go is almost an automatic, right? So if I work for Patagonia, it's gotta be something to do with environment. I mean, we discussed this, it attracts a certain number of people. But suppose that I make nails, right? I make something that as a product has a gap, but I want to use this thing, which you just started. So, but then I have a heterogeneity of possible causes I could look at. And there's going to be preferences amongst my workforce for these different causes. It seems to me that your setting would allow you to sort of analyze these things. Because one of the interesting questions would be, do we go with the one that's preferred by the majority? Or do we weight that by, yeah? So, yeah, you obviously thought about it. So tell me.
Right. So I think one way to ask a question, if I understand it right, is if I could choose how heterogeneous my workforce is in terms of what causes they care about, do I want a homogeneous workforce? We all care about the same cause, or do I want a heterogeneous one where different people care about different things? I think the answer is maybe less obvious than it seems, and it depends crucially on whether the firm can observe the cause of the individual agent or not. Right? Suppose I cannot. Right? Suppose I know that different people like different things, but I don't know who is who. In that case, I want the most homogeneous workforce that I have, because I'm going to suffer the leakage problem anyway. But now the scale is going to be bigger if everybody cares about the same issue than if you care about different issues. Right? I'm better off contributing $1,000 to one cause than contributing $100 to K different causes whenever people are successful. Right? Because I cannot fine tune, I cannot give 200 in some cases and 100 here. It has to be the same across all these causes. Right? You will want to do it that way. If, however, I can observe who's who, then it's not so clear because now I can avoid the leakage problem by having a more heterogeneous workforce, right? And so essentially, once that happens, I can make this public good more of a private good. And that might well be better, right? It might well be better if that G is private than if it's public. Because yeah, you give up scale, but you do avoid leakage. You get the targeting advantage. So it's not clear whether you want.
So the question is whether the workers would volunteer that information should you wish to acquire it. And here I'm thinking of a mechanism. So in British supermarket, there's a British supermarket, Waitrose, that they make donations. But one of the ways they have like 3 or 4 possibilities. You get a token when you pay for your shopping, and you get to put tokens in different slots. And I don't know whether they do it like whoever gets the most tokens gets the donation, or I think they do it proportionally to the number of tokens or something. It seems to me that it would be kind of easy to elicit which cause do you support. I don't know that there will be a lot of strategic incentives for people to lie about that. So I think the assumption that you know what they support is pretty weak. So I'd be interested. I think I appreciate this. This is maybe another paper. I think that would be an interesting question to pursue given all of that. Yeah.
I totally agree. Let me just maybe add by stepping slightly outside of the model. My sense is that in practice, firms want to have fairly homogeneous workforces where everybody cares about environment or everybody cares about poverty alleviation. It might have to do with the collaboration issue we talked about, is that donations are good in settings in which collaboration is important. And maybe outside of the model, we have an easier time collaborating with each other if we care about the same issues than if we don't. Another issue that comes up that's outside of the model and standard economics is there's this sense that employees only respond to these purpose commitments if they think in some sense they're authentic, that the firm actually cares about that. And if it's just a means to an end where the end is more work and more profit, then maybe it works less well. And so I wonder if we're supporting all these different purposes and maybe they're changing over time, then it's clear that we don't care about the purpose. And so it's less effective. So this is just some thoughts outside of the model. But I agree with you that looking at what this model says about do I want a homogeneous workforce or do I want a heterogeneous one is a natural and interesting question. And I think you're muted still.
You're muted. Francesco, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. So I was saying, as a counterpoint, what you're saying, I mean, suppose I care about environmental issues, but there's a gazillion of things that could actually. So I might care about the red panda versus the standard panda. I mean, I could make it as fine as you can, right? And so maybe a company could say, we're very environmentally friendly. We're trying to protect this particular species. But I might have all the environmental concerns in the world. But I think actually maybe we should be working on less cuddly animals, which are more important for the ecosystem. You see what I mean? I might have I think that issue isn't going to go away in some sense, right?
Yeah.
So
no, I think those are very good questions, and I'm hoping that they're questions to which we might have a partial answer through this model, but it's not clear exactly how to do it so far.
Can I ask?
Max,
Unless there's someone
yes.
else. So I was trying
To think through, a polar case or a corner solution when wage doesn't matter. So in the chat, we discussed a bit about a corner solution itself, but now let's think about a different sort of scenario. It's not a firm, it's an army unit or whatever, defense of a village. So there is no payment, there's no wage, but there is a purpose, right? So everyone needs to contribute to. Not needs to, but that's the reward for everyone. Without wage, we don't have the flexibility, which was pointed out in the chat. But if there was some kind of technology that allows to allocate people to different efforts that are, good jobs, bad jobs, peeling potatoes, cleaning toilets, and more there's flexibility restored in that way. So there's, again, a second dimension.
Right.
Would that fit, or am I wrong? It's a completely different.
So if I understand you right, I think it fits. I think the key difference for us is it a public good or a private good? We don't care whether the private good is money or cleaning the toilets or something else. The question is it public or private? Another version of this that's closer perhaps to the army example you give is you could think, well, yeah, we care about the donation, I care about the cause, but I also care about how much I personally contribute to it. How much of the donation is due to my own efforts, right? Which in that literature they call warm glow. So you could add warm glow to the model. But what that does is just muddies the water. Now the donation is a little bit of a public good and is a little bit of a private good. So I think in terms of modeling, it's not a good choice to go down that route. But I think in terms of practice, I imagine that's very much what we do. If I don't have money and I only have purpose to motivate you with, well, there's still a way to individualize that, either by sending you to clean the toilets or by saying, hey, this guy over here, he did a really good job and has had a bigger contribution to the purpose than others have.
Okay, so one question from me as well, in case nobody else has a question. So I don't know, obviously this is going to be a bit outside of the model as well, but I mean, many companies sometimes use all of these donations as a way to entice the consumers to buy the products, right? So, so I remember, I think Tom, that you were mentioning, was saying, whenever you buy a pair of shoes, we're going to donate the pair of shoes to somebody who doesn't have any shoes. So I don't know whether, can we use your model in some way to talk about this issue as well, and how donations can influence consumers?
So I totally agree. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind is when you hear firms making these kind of donations, it's about attracting consumers versus motivating employees. That literature that I mentioned earlier looks at that issue and has this non-result that unless I have a technological advantage, the firm does not solve the free rider problem. I think the issue with that literature is that they're assuming a particular rule that the firm is going to follow, where just donate a fixed amount for any unit that you give, that you buy. Okay, I think it'd be interesting to go beyond that. Or another way to say this is this model here looks at using public goods in the moral hazard problem. I could imagine using it as a screening device in an adverse selection setting, where I don't know how much you value the good, I don't know how much you value the donation, and I'm trying to use money and the donation to screen between the different consumers. I think that's a different model from the one we have, but I think it's a natural follow-up model. And I think it would do something slightly different from what that existing literature is currently already doing.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting.
Just to add, there are models out there of non-money transfers, right? So time, effort, or things which are private goods. You guys are thinking about public goods, which actually might be interesting, right? So sometimes we ration things through queues, right? Instead of raising prices, we let people queue, and there are reasons for that, right? Maybe money would be considered badly, right? So restaurants don't like to leave to raise, to charge. What is it called again? I'm sorry. This is your Northwestern thing, purple pricing. So that's the whole point behind that, right? That's one of those ideas. It might be interesting to think about whether there's things where you could do this instead, because queuing is an essentially inefficient thing to do. You're just waiting. You're screening through something wasteful, whereas public goods are not necessarily inefficient, right? Actually, they shouldn't be, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so I think we're right on time. So I think we're going to stop the recording now. So thank you very much, Niko and Luis,
Thank you.
both Luis, for coming. And
Thank you.
we hope to see